Despite Donald Trump's constant denials of Russian collusion, a profound geopolitical realignment appears to be underway as the Kremlin has officially signaled its approval of the Trump administration's emerging national security strategy. The shift coincides with a tense period of diplomatic maneuvering wherein Washington is exerting significant pressure on Ukraine to finalize a peace framework, while prominent voices within the American political sphere threaten to sever financial support entirely.
I said, but he was on television before and after saying there was massive collusion, like Putin was my best friend. We had no calls to Russia. We had no calls from Russia for years. And all of a sudden, we have this great friendship. And by the way, getting along with Russia is a great thing. Getting along with Putin and Russia is a great thing. And stuff like this makes it impossible. And that leads to very bad things, very bad things.
Yesterday, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov offered a rare and glowing assessment of American policy, describing the latest White House national security document as an encouraging development that largely mirrors Russian geopolitical perspectives. This praise follows the release of a strategy paper on Friday in which the Trump regime sharply criticized the European Union, suggesting the bloc faces the risk of civilisational erasure, while simultaneously advocating for a rapprochement with Moscow. The adjustments that we see correspond in many ways to our vision, Peskov stated, noting with approval the Trump regime's inclination toward dialogue and building good relations. However, the Kremlin official tempered his optimism with a warning drawn from populist rhetoric, suggesting that an entrenched American deep state might attempt to sabotage the president's vision for a new détente. This warming rhetoric serves as the backdrop for an intense behind-the-scenes push to end the war in Ukraine. US officials have characterized the negotiations as being in their final stages. Keith Kellogg, Donald Trump's outgoing envoy for Ukraine, told a defense forum on Saturday that the regime's efforts were within the last 10 meters, citing territory disputes and the status of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant as the only remaining hurdles. Despite the optimism projected by American officials, the reality on the ground suggests a stalemate. Diplomatic sources indicate that neither Kiev nor Moscow is prepared to sign the current framework proposed by Trump's negotiating team. The past week saw a flurry of high-level shuttle diplomacy, with Trump's envoys and property developers Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner visiting Moscow, followed by a Ukrainian delegation arriving in Florida for 3 days of talks. Following these meetings, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky engaged in what was described as a difficult 2-hour telephone conversation with US officials on Saturday evening. While Zelensky publicly stated on social media that Ukraine is determined to keep working in good faith and that discussions covered points to eliminate the threat of a new Russian full-scale invasion, the friction is palpable. The core sticking point remains security guarantees. It's unclear if the US or its European allies are willing or able to offer the kind of ironclad protection, such as troop deployments, that would deter future Russian aggression if Ukraine concedes territory of its sovereign nation. While official negotiators worked through diplomatic channels, the rhetoric from Donald Trump's inner circle has turned increasingly hostile towards the Ukrainian leadership. Speaking at a conference in Doha on Sunday, Donald Trump Jr., he delivered a blistering critique of the war, suggesting that the US might simply walk away from the conflict. Although he holds no formal administration role, the president's eldest son is a central figure in the MAGA movement and reflects the views of a powerful faction within the Trump orbit. In a lengthy tirade, he falsely accused President Zelensky of prolonging the war solely to avoid facing an electorate that might remove him from power. He characterized the Ukrainian leader as a borderline deity to the American left, while asserting without evidence that Ukraine is far more corrupt than Russia. He argued that there was no incentive to stop the conflict as long as Western aid continued to flow without audit. He further disparaged European efforts to manage the crisis, specifically targeting the EU's foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas. He dismissed European sanctions as counterproductive measures that merely inflated oil prices to Russia's benefit. When asked if his father might abandon this peace process entirely, Trump Jr. cited his father's unpredictability and vowed that the US would no longer be the idiot with the checkbook. He also minimized the geopolitical importance of the conflict, stating that in his view the risk of Venezuelan boats smuggling fentanyl into the US was a far more clear and present danger than the war in Europe. The divergence between Washington's rhetoric and Kiev's survival needs has forced Ukraine to look closer to home for support. Zelensky has arrived in Downing Street for a critical four-way summit. He will meet with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. This meeting highlights the growing burden on European powers to provide the security assurances the White House may be withholding. Zelensky has frequently turned to these allies when pressure from Washington to cede territory intensifies. However, the political landscape in Europe is also shifting, and the capacity of these nations to fill the void left by a potential US withdrawal remains uncertain. While diplomats debate frameworks in luxury venues, the situation for ordinary Ukrainians is becoming increasingly dire. The country is entering its fourth winter of full-scale war under a barrage of Russian aerial assaults. On Friday night, Russia launched a massive strike involving over 600 drones and 50 missiles. This was followed by targeted attacks on Saturday night aimed at energy infrastructure in the central city of Kremenchuk and the northern Cherniv region, leaving vast swathes of the population without power, heating or water. Compounding the external military threat is internal instability. Zelensky's administration has been weakened by a corruption scandal that recently claimed his powerful chief of staff, Andriy Yermak. Analysts in Kiev note that while the military situation has not yet collapsed to the point of forcing total capitulation, the combination of energy grid failures, battlefield exhaustion, and the potential withdrawal of American support signals a bleak and dangerous winter ahead. Beyond the immediate battlefield, a profound sense of foreboding has gripped European capitals as Washington appears to pivot ideologically toward Moscow. The Trump regime's explicit criticism of the European Union, described in strategy documents as risking civilisational erasure, combined with its open courtship of the Kremlin, threatens to dismantle the transatlantic security architecture that has stood for decades. For leaders in London, Paris and Berlin, the fear is no longer just about managing a war on their eastern flank, but about the prospect of a United States that views the EU not as a partner, but as a failing project to be sidelined. As the White House prioritizes dialogue with Putin while disparaging traditional alliances, European powers are forced to confront the terrifying reality of facing a revanchist Russia without the American shield, fundamentally altering the continent's strategic calculus for generations to come. Proof positive that Donald Trump has failed to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. I'm Anthony Davis. You can find me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel and podcast, on Wednesdays co-hosting Uncovered, and on Sunday on The Weekend Show with Midas Touch.